Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second of 2 days of the Joint Special Operations University Forum. I'm your host, Doug Jordan. And for many of you who were present yesterday, welcome back. Again, this is a quarterly engagement sponsored by the Joint Special Operations University. These fora focus on matters relating to the use and utility of special operations forces, exploring our role in a competitive global environment with highly complex, complicated, intersectional, and compound security challenges. These engagements are intended for the greater special operations community, and we welcome researchers, academics, industry, and international partners to actively participate in order to advance the body of knowledge for special operations. Today, we're going to build on the insights that we gleaned from yesterday's series of panels. Before we begin, I need to once again review some administrative points. First, all material presented today and all discussion, including those in the chat, need to be maintained at the unclassified level. Please do not risk a hot microphone or loose typing in the chat. Secondly, the opinions in this forum are those of the presenters and may not necessarily be the official views of the United States government, Department of Defense, United States Special Operations Command, partners or allies, or the Joint Special Operations University. We are privileged today to begin day 2 of this forum with a very special guest speaker. It is advantageous to have experienced professionals and leaders, whether tenured professors or retired officials, who can reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of the recent past and suggest how observations may inform future operations, activities, and investments. JSOU invited Lieutenant General Michael Nagata, U.S. Army retired, to fulfill this role today for the forum. He comes with deep experience. 34 of his 38 years of his professional military career was in special operations, including operations in multiple regions, as well as tour as the commander of Special Operations Command, Central Command. And then he served as Deputy of Strategy for the National Counterterrorism Center in Washington, D.C. We ask him to reflect on his experience and his continued engagement on the employment of influence operations activities and some of the investments for operational and strategic effects. Please give your attention to General Michael Nagata. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good day, everyone, wherever you happen to be. I want to start by thanking the Joint Special Operations University for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about a series of related topics that are, I think, of growing strategic importance globally, not just for the United States, but for all our allies and partners around the world as well. To give you a little more transparency about my current activities, aside from what you've already heard, my principal employment today is as the strategic advisor and as a senior vice president for a defense company called CACI International, which is a high technology and expertise national security company based in Northern Virginia. I'm also affiliated with 5 different national security think tanks in Washington, D.C., particularly the Middle East Institute, and I run my own very tiny one-man national security LLC. Rather predictably, what I'm proudest of is the more than 3 decades that I spent in the world of special operations. And just like pretty much everybody else of my SOF generation, I spent the last 20 years in all the usual suspect places. And as all of you know, those locations were always complex, sometimes hostile, and sometimes quite dangerous. Though it may sound counterintuitive to some of you, I believe that even when I wasn't overseas, and particularly after I'd attained flag rank, I was still constantly deployed to what I came to consider to often be the most hostile, the most complex, and the most dangerous place that I had to spend time in. And that is Washington, D.C., where, God help me, I still live today. More seriously, I did 2 tours in the Pentagon, one as a policy officer in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the other on the Joint Staff, where I was the Deputy Director for Special Operations, and 2 assignments in the intelligence community, including my last job at the National Counterterrorism Center, where I was arguably the senior counterterrorism strategist in the U.S. government for 3 years. More seriously, a lot of what I'm going to describe today is just as much drawn from my experience in this Beltway battlefield as it is taken from my overseas deployments. Now, before continuing, I want to acknowledge that there are many people in the audience who are not of American citizenship or born in the United States. So if this seems a little US-centric for the remainder of remarks, my apologies, but I hope that you will find at least some of what I'm about to say applicable to your own conditions as well. As you've already heard, I only tend to speak from prepared remarks for perhaps about 40 to 45 minutes, and then move as swiftly as I can to Q&A. I always believe that the greatest value from a session like this lies more in a dialogue with you than in your having to sit through a long-winded sermon from someone like me. I also do not appear before you today to deliberately provoke you, but I am hopeful that my remarks will be provocative enough to encourage a lively conversation. Now, my object today is to share my views regarding strategic influence and communication, and as you've seen from the title, in the context of what some call a compound security environment, or what others call a world of near-peer adversaries challenging the United States. And we've also used terms like great power competition, and most recently, we're calling this strategic competition. But before diving more deeply into this, I want to offer all of you a description of my topic this morning that I think has the advantage of perhaps being a little clearer, easier to understand, and perhaps more operationally and strategically useful than the preceding characterizations. In my judgment, for at least the last 2 decades, the United States has found itself embroiled in a global contest over American influence. It's hard to precisely define when this struggle began, though I now believe that many American leaders and policymakers have taken far too long to recognize it. And among the consequences that have flowed from that delay has been a very significant, and in some places still ongoing, erosion of American influence globally. I'm going to try to explain what I've just said in greater detail, why this has happened, and at least a few remedies that are now required from leaders across the United States government, whether military or civilian. As a starting point, one of the unfortunate consequences of how all over the place the US government has been about its various naming conventions for today's strategic challenge is that too many people in and out of government all think they're talking about and trying to solve the same set of problems for America. But in too many cases, I've come to believe that they actually are not. They're chasing related, but often very different goals. As an example, I'm very confident that if I were to drive back into Washington, D.C., which is just a few minutes away from me, and took any one of the more recent terms of art we have been using, such as great power or strategic competition, or the term compound security environment, tracked down a dozen of my former policy level colleagues, handed each of them a blank sheet of paper, and asked them to write down their definition of any of those terms, I'm quite confident that I'd receive a lot of substantially different answers, which, if true, means we are confusing ourselves at best and possibly causing some parts of our own government to work at cross purposes or on divergent trajectories from other parts of our government without anybody realizing it for prolonged periods of time. If accurate, this means we are creating self-inflicted friction, self-inflicted gaps, perhaps even self-inflicted injuries, all of which are tantamount to unforced errors. And regardless of what particular naming convention we adopt, we're still too often plagued by a pattern of leaders in the US government making what I consider to be a mostly false distinction between competition and conflict. Too often in this town, people seem to speak and think about them as if they are almost 2 different planets, and therefore essentially treat them as silos. I've even heard senior officials in this town assert that great power competition is a civilian problem and great power conflict is a military problem, and thereby making even stronger the notion that these 2 things are silos or worlds apart from each other. I personally very strongly believe that competition and conflict are simply 2 different faces of the same coin, and whatever the boundary line between them may actually be, that boundary has become more and more porous, making it easier for any actor, including our adversaries, to migrate back and forth between competition and conflict than possibly any time in preceding human history. Unfortunately, this confusion and inconsistency that I've tried to describe among American leaders has masked, or in some cases distracted them from achieving an adequate understanding of what I believe history clearly shows. That in the aftermath of World War II and the enormous destruction that was visited on huge portions of the human population, and because the United States decided to become strategically generous in rebuilding large parts of a shattered world, America rose to become the single most influential nation on earth, whatever our other imperfections might be. And correspondingly, it has primarily been the United States' outsized influence for decades that has resulted in the unprecedented economic prosperity and security that we and our families have enjoyed for many decades. Indeed, we've come to take it for granted, though now this is being challenged and changed right in front of our eyes. I personally believe that the historical record demonstrates that the fact the United States exerted itself to rebuilding major parts, not only of our allied countries, but even of the very countries that had begun that global war, and then continued that pattern of strategic generosity to rebuilding countries like South Korea, starting in the 1950s, gave us the influence, standing, and credibility to lead the effort to create entirely new global institutions, such as the World Bank, the United Nations, and many other things besides. We even adopted a new term for ourselves. We Americans came to call ourselves the leader of the free world. But some American leaders seem today to have forgotten that those words, leader of the free world, were not written by the finger of God on a stone tablet and brought down to us from some mountaintop. We chose to earn that title through strategic generosity that nobody was compelling us to provide, and the result was that we could credibly claim the leader's title in ways that a very large part of the world willingly acquiesced to. But in my view, and quite sadly, in more recent years, it has become clear to me that some American leaders began adopting a very different trajectory, a trajectory away from being the generous actor on the world stage and becoming instead a more and more transactional actor. Instead of perpetuating the strategic generosity that had served us so well for decades, we started hearing a growing number of American leaders instead start using phrases such as, quote, "We need to stop wasting taxpayer dollars on lazy people who won't solve their own problems," unquote, which also led to equally perverse attitudes such as, if we're not getting what we want out of a strategic relationship, we should just ditch the relationship. What we didn't seem to realize at the time, and I believe in some ways we are still struggling to understand today, is that this kind of attitude means we were becoming just another transactional country on the world stage, which ultimately meant we began relinquishing some of the enormous strategic benefits that we have historically derived from being strategically generous. Now, because I'm a retired general officer, I think I'm compelled to tell war stories, although the story I'm about to tell you is not a war story, but I think it is instructive nonetheless. In 1984, which is somewhere before the Jurassic age of the development of the Earth, I was a young first lieutenant going through the U.S. Army Special Forces Qualification Course in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. As is always the case, there were international students in my class. There was one particular officer, very impressive gentleman, who was from Africa. And I noticed that anytime we were on a break, anytime we were having a casual conversation, somewhere in the conversation, he would bring up the fact that he loved America. But what struck me was I also knew that he'd never been to America before. He'd never been in the United States before. So one day I went up to him and I asked him, "Why do you keep talking about how much you love America? It's very nice to hear, but I don't get it. You've never been here before." He gave me an answer that was unforgettable. He started by asking me a question. He asked me if I knew how he had learned to read and write, which I thought was a complete non sequitur. So I said, no, I have no idea how you learn to read and write. What does that have to do with my question? And then he told me this. He told me when he was a young boy living in a village in his country, one day, this strange foreigner showed up, clearly not from Africa. So he asked his parents, all the kids in the village asked their own parents, who is this stranger? Who is this strange person? Where is he from? What is he doing here? His parents told him, well, he's an American. He's from a country called the United States. And he's going to stay for us for a season, stay with us for a season. And he's going to teach you and all the other children in this village how to read and write. He was from the Peace Corps. And that officer then told me, he said, had that American not come to my village and taught me how to read and write, I would never have gone to school. I would never have the chance to become a military officer. And I certainly would not be here at the Special Forces Qualification Course. And then he paused and he looked at me and he said, Lieutenant Nagata, I love America. Now, anecdotes don't prove anything, but I think it is an instructive anecdote at the very least. Now, of course, I was asked to talk today about strategic influence, not just individual influence, communication paradigms in a compound security environment. So in the remaining time that I have left, I'm going to try to describe what I consider to be some of the most important aspects of these terms. First, and beyond what I've already said about strategic influence and how its foundational requirement is an attitude of strategic generosity that distinguishes the United States from more transactional actors, what does it mean? What does it take to gain and maintain influence, whether tactical or strategic, in today's world? Well, aside from what I've already said about the irreplaceable importance of generosity in winning influence, there is another aspect of generosity that I think deserves more attention, and that is the generosity required to build personal relationships, not professional relationships, personal relationships, and the dedication of significant time, effort, and risk acceptance to build those personal relationships. I doubt there is anyone listening to me today that hasn't had an experience where sometime in your life, you had a very crucial need that was very difficult to meet, and you went to someone who was a dear friend and asked them to sacrifice time or money or effort to help you. If that person truly was your friend, someone you had a close personal relationship with, the answer was probably immediate and positive, and your friend didn't stop to count the costs or consider the downsides. He just did what you asked. Why? Well, because he or she was more than just your acquaintance. This was someone who believed his or her personal relationship with you was so important. They probably said, or at least thought, something like, you know, I wouldn't do this for anyone else, but I'll do this for you because you're my friend. Well, this phenomenon also exists at the strategic level between nations and other powerful actors. The various applications of the power that comes from personal relationships are too numerous to recite in the time available to me. So let me cut to the chase. If American national security practitioners are serious about recreating a degree of U.S. influence around the world that can undo the erosion of influence that too many of our adversaries are now taking advantage of, and probably helped to create to begin with, we must find a way to significantly alter our current practice of relatively short-term overseas deployments. Just as Rome wasn't built in a day, the kinds of powerfully durable personal relationships I'm trying to describe cannot be created in 3-month deployment cycles. Of course, some of this can be somewhat mitigated by recycling the same people repeatedly into the same operational environment. Many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But there is still turbulence as a result that can result in suboptimal relationships. And there is simply no substitute for finding ways to enable and incentivize people to commit 2 years to the same part of the world. I can speak from personal experience here because I once spent 3 years in Pakistan. So again, I'm going to tell you an anecdote. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, but I think it is instructive. After I had been in Pakistan for more than a year, one of my jobs was to facilitate coordination between the Army of Pakistan in the East and ISAF forces and coalition forces in the West. One night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, I got an emergency phone call from ISAF asking if I could convince the Pakistani military to stop conducting a set of operations right on the border with Afghanistan that were creating operational problems for ISAF. Like I said, it was 1 o'clock in the morning. Fortunately, though, I had met with a particular 3-star general in the Pakistan Army that he was willing to give me his cell phone number. So a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, I woke him up. I described the situation as it had been relayed to me by ISAF, and I asked him to stop the operations they were conducting. It was a long conversation, but again, let me cut to the chase. Towards the end of the conversation, this 3-star general in Pakistan that I'd known for about a year finally said to me, "All right, General Nagata, what you are asking me to do is incredibly difficult. There will be some of my colleagues who will be very angry with me when they learn that I am going to do what you are asking me to do. But you have been very trustworthy, you have been very reliable, and it has been pleasant to work with you. Because you are asking me to do this, I will do what you ask. I would not do this for anyone else." Turns out he was as good as his word. He stopped the operational activity that was creating such a problem for ISAF. Now, I'm not trying to make myself out to be a hero for convincing him. The point I'm trying to drive at is that I worked on that relationship for more than a year until finally he was willing to acquiesce to what I was asking because I had demonstrated to him that I was his friend. I suppose some of you may think I was just manipulating him. What I think I was doing was leveraging the benefits that flow from creating a strong personal relationship. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, particularly this notion that we should find ways to deploy our people into these complex environments for more than short deployment cycles. But Nagata, the family separation, the degradation of professional development back home that these deployed people would not be able to take advantage of, and things like that, the consequences of what you're suggesting are too harmful. Perhaps there are downsides to everything, but how consistently and strongly do we consider the question of, for example, why can't we, in some places and in some cases, send our families to the very same places we send our operators? Why can't professional education be done more virtually? Of course, if it's too dangerous or unstable or just too austere for our families in a foreign operational environment that we send our people to, could families be sent to live in a nearby region or country at government expense? By way of example, the State Department's Foreign Service has a very long tradition of allowing family members to find employment in the very same embassies that their State Department family members work from, enabling much longer tours of duty for the Foreign Service that pays huge dividends in terms of their day-to-day effectiveness. If they can do it, why can't DoD do something like it? Why can't SOF find pathways like this? It is hard, it is complex, there are risks involved. But I personally believe the benefits we would derive in terms of our ability to create the kinds of personal relationships that generate influence, I think it's worth exploring. I'm not trying to make light of how complex or expensive or culturally challenging what I've just described would be. But if you believe, as I do, that the strength of personal relationships can create operational and strategic effects that nothing else can, what are we willing to do to ensure we actually achieve those effects? Secondly, I believe the US government must become much more vigorous about accessing and employing the power of communications and messaging in the digital age, and how I believe US effectiveness in more adequately and effectively using that power is being thwarted, not principally by our adversaries, but by our own risk aversion and risk intolerance. Said more simply, our biggest problem is not the enemy. Our biggest problem is our own behavior and our own choices, particularly at senior leaders of the US government. Now, it should be axiomatic for everyone by this stage of humanity's existence that we now live in a digital world where the preponderance of what people everywhere believe, value, and the ways in which those beliefs and values influence what people anywhere on the planet choose to do is visible and available more and more in the digital world we all increasingly live in, whether on social media, through increasingly pervasive virtual communications of many different types, and in some ways increasingly indistinguishable from real people and real environments. The trend toward literally anyone being able to access or influence another person's beliefs, values, and day-to-day choices is now unstoppable. Rather obviously, that also means that increasingly people anywhere have the opportunity to influence what another group of people believe, value, and what they choose to do, even if they are never, ever co-located in the same physical space. Now, one would think that America, since we were largely responsible for creating very large portions of this digital global environment, and particularly America's national security organizations, would be at the very forefront of this trend, and today have become undisputed in their ability to take advantage of this virtual world to encourage people and their governments everywhere to believe, value, and thereby make choices that advance both the interests and the values of the United States and democracies everywhere. Unfortunately, I believe that has not happened. And what I want to spend at least a few minutes providing is my own diagnosis as to why. First, I think that the most important and basic answer is that we have too often failed to cultivate leaders that are enthusiastic about taking risks in this digital virtual environment. While it is also obvious that we have capability gaps in some cases, many parts of the US government are not adequately funded for this mission, and training and education for successfully operating in this digital environment is definitely lacking in too many places. Nonetheless, I still maintain that risk aversion is our biggest problem, and also probably the hardest thing to overcome because that aversion is so culturally ingrained. Again, a couple of stories, a couple of anecdotes. The first one is a pretty famous story. There are probably some eyewitnesses in this group, just like I was back in the day. When I once had the great good fortune to be a task force commander for retired General Stanley McChrystal, there was that famous episode when a very frustrated Stan McChrystal was asking his Judge Advocate General, let me get this straight. This terrorist bad guy that we're trying to do something about, I can drop a 500-pound bomb on his head right now, but I cannot send him an email to influence his behavior. And I remember his attorney saying, yes, sir, that is correct. You can kill him, but you can't send him an email. Now, as morbidly funny as that description might be, it also should be very sobering, because in many ways, we still have this problem. We are more enthusiastic about using kinetic power, and thereby we invest more in that capability than we have ever invested or provided to influence and information operations. The second story is a more recent story. This was during the time I had the great good fortune to be the SOCCENT commander. We were in the very early days of the fight against the Islamic State. And as some of you may recall, one of the task forces that we created to deal with the ISIS problem was headquartered in Jordan. I was on battlefield circulation. I had finished my briefings to the day, so I did what most people would do. I wandered out into the Joint Operations Center and just walked around listening to conversations and talking to people. At one point during this particular visit, I noticed that there were a group of 4 or 5 Green Berets clustered around a laptop, having a bit of a debate with each other. I was not close enough to hear all the conversation. I wasn't close enough to be in the conversation, but I could overhear a big chunk of it. And what they were debating was whether or not we and Central Command had the authority to counter message one particularly energetic and unfortunately highly effective ISIS media practitioner. But I also noticed while I was listening to this debate that one of the Jordanian officers assigned to my staff was on the other side of this group, and he was doing the same thing I was. He was eavesdropping on the conversation. But after a few minutes, I saw him walk away, and a few minutes later, he came back, but this time he walked right into the middle of those Green Berets. And he said in perfect English, "Gentlemen, I've taken care of it." And the Americans all looked at him and said, "What do you mean you've taken care of it? What did you do?" We weren't debating what to do. We were trying to figure out if we had the authority to do something. You can't just go ahead and do it. We don't think we have the authority to do this. Well, that Jordanian officer looked at those Americans rather offended, and he said, "You are Americans. I am Jordanian. You may not have the authority to do anything about this. This is my country. I can do anything I want to." And so I took care of it. And he turned on his heel and he walked off in a huff. Rightly so. I remember thinking as I listened to that conversation, this might be how we lose the war. Fortunately, we did not, but it was a pretty troubling passage, as you might imagine, and obviously unforgettable for me to this very day. Now, in my judgment, these two anecdotes illuminate a rather sobering reality for the United States that we fail to address at our strategic peril. Until and unless we adopt a more risk-tolerant approach toward our strategic, operational, and tactical communications and messaging activities, we will be forever outmaneuvered, outperformed, and outlasted by adversaries who are demonstrating every single day they are far more risk-tolerant. This is an arena where it matters not how many aircraft carriers, infantry divisions, or nuclear weapons America may have. This is an arena where the only thing that matters is how credible and persuasive you are in the virtual world. And if we want genuinely global, strategic, and durable effects in this environment, then we must become accustomed to accepting far more risk in this world so that we learn how to be more strategically effective faster and thereby become more proficient. But ladies and gentlemen, all of you know, risk tolerance or intolerance is a leadership choice. If leaders will underwrite the risk, the rest of the organization will follow. If leaders refuse to underwrite the risk, that's a cue for the entire organization. Don't accept any risk here, which means we'll never get any better. Finally, and perhaps a little more specific to the world of special operations forces, the question of what is the principal benefit, not just for the Department of Defense, but really for the United States writ large and potentially for some of our allies around the world. What is the principal benefit of providing special operations forces for the kinds of contests and competitions that we are now embroiled in? I'm going to come at this by talking about readiness. There's been a lot of talk, including well before I retired, in SOCOM and among the various soft components, but what does it mean to be ready for great power competition or strategic competition? And rather predictably, a lot of the attention has gone to where it has traditionally gone. Do we have the weapons platforms? Do we have the mobility platforms? Do we have the communication systems? Do we have the training and doctrine? So that we can apply principally our kinetic abilities in this new world we are now in. But what I very rarely heard, and still very rarely hear today when I have the opportunity to dive back into the special operations world, is what I can personally consider to be a more useful and more important characterization of what SOF can contribute. And it's not original thought. It's something that I marinated in, and probably many of you marinated in for much of your careers. But it's an idea that I don't think we give enough attention to. that what we should be striving to be in this new world of competition and conflict is our readiness to be what we have always claimed to be, the world's greatest problem solvers. In my own personal view, one of the somewhat perverse consequences of 20 years of war has been that too often people in the special operations world have come to define themselves by what they do instead of how they think. Many of our people characterize themselves, if you ask them to define themselves, they'll give you answers like, well, I'm an assaulter, or I'm a breacher, or I'm a sniper, or I'm a pilot, or I'm a crewman. And those are important descriptions, though those are important aspects of our identities, to be sure. But in my judgment, none of them are as important as that simple statement. I am part of a community that strives to be the world's greatest problem solvers. Or said slightly differently, I want to be handed wicked, nasty, complex, potentially very dangerous problems that nobody else knows how to solve. I want that problem. I live for that problem. And I define myself by how well I can solve that problem, whatever it may be. In my personal opinion, given the strategic context we now operate in, I think I can make an argument that never has the belief that we strive to be the world's greatest problem solvers been as important as it is now. But we have some work to do here, because as I've already characterized, we've lapsed a fair amount into instead seeing ourselves through the lens of what we do instead of how we think. And if today's challenges are nothing else, they are a thinking person's problem, because they are so complex, they are so global, they are so interconnected, they are so immersed in the new digital and virtual world we live in, that it is an incredibly complex and wicked problem. And that is the way in which we should see ourselves. All right. There are so many other things I wish I had the time to talk about, but I promised that I would get to Q&A in a reasonable amount of time. So I'm going to stop there. I would love to be challenged or questions about anything I have talked about today. If you would like me to hold forth on some other topic, if I know anything about it, I'd be pleased to do that as well. So let me just stop there and turn it back over to the moderator.
So, sir, thanks for your comments. And you covered a lot of ground, and it really builds nicely on the conversation yesterday. I see you smiling, so you know that there's lots of buzz going on in the chat. So some of these questions, I'm going to kind of amalgamate them because you sparked a lot of interest in a lot of different areas. One of the things is, with all your great experience in the Beltway, all of government, really kind of almost all of society approaches, because in the Beltway at NCTC, a lot of outreach into industry and academia and things like that. What kind of, looking back on it now, what is SOCOM being asked to do in the information space by the rest of government? And now that you've had some time and distance, what maybe is SOCOM's strengths in this area, and what are some opportunities in the information space that you're seeing?
Thank you. That's a very important question. In fact, I think it's a very broad question, so I'm only going to be able to address a couple of pieces of it. But here goes. The first thing that came to mind is that even while I was on active duty, I started hearing people, very senior people in Washington, D.C., use language to the effect of, well, we're pivoting away from having to deal with terrorist organizations because we have more important things to do. So we're going to use special operations forces as basically a stay behind covering force for the thing we care less about, so that we can do the more important work of great power competition or what have you. That, I know that sounds a little pejorative, but frankly, it came across as pejorative every time I heard it. And I heard it a lot. I still hear it today. What's been very interesting over the last couple of years in my view, what I've started to see is a gradual turn back. It's very gradual and incomplete, but I've seen some policymakers start to turn back to special operations forces because the results that they've achieved so far by just consigning SOF to counterterrorism activities have been so disappointing. And so almost as if they're grasping at straws in some cases. Okay, well, what we tried to do for the last couple of years really hasn't worked. So maybe let's go ask these SOF guys if they can do anything. Again, I know that sounds awfully pejorative. It may be a little unfair, but it was the first thing I thought of given the question. So I'm going to answer a question that you kind of didn't ask, which is kind of the lazy man's way of answering your question, but it's something I wanted to talk about anyways. We should be using our own influence, and our influence is considerable because of the prestige and credibility we derive from 20 years of armed conflict against terrorism. We should use some of that influence. We should use some of that access with our own policymakers, with our own American leaders, to suggest that these are very wicked, very complex problems in a digital world where personal relationships and problem solving really are the keys to unlocking success. And that is our strength, or at least it's supposed to be our strength. And we can apply those abilities to build and nourish personal relationships and solve wicked problems in ways that many other forces and many other organizations cannot. You know, in some ways, I'm talking about taking advantage of the fact that in too many places, the strategic returns on American activity for the last decade or so to try to recover some of our influence haven't worked very well. So perhaps now is the time for us to show up on somebody's doorstep and say, this might be something I could solve for you, or at least contribute to a solution for you.
You talked quite a bit about SOF's role in building partner capacity in a lot of the, I would say, the SOF core competencies. There's a lot of interest, looking at the situation in Ukraine. The next panel is from Ukraine, the National Security Council, and the National Defense University. What are some lessons that we can learn in the influence space? Your experience in Pakistan, the Middle East, but looking at Ukraine, what do you think that SOCOM can learn from Ukraine, and what are maybe some lessons learned in the building partner capacity success that we saw in SOCOM in Ukraine?
Thank you. I have no personal experience in the Ukraine, but my perception is that the benefits we derive from building partner capacity, particularly in Ukrainian SOF, for many years now, has paid off in ways, has strategically paid off in ways that we have seen before. Another very vivid example that I think is in many ways very similar, although in a very different context, the journey that U.S. Special Operations Forces took in first creating and then perpetuating a relationship with Iraqi SOF. Many of you are very aware, there probably are even some participants in this audience who remember that the creation of Iraq Special Forces began as a 1208 program right after the invasion. We then built their capacity to the point they became indispensable in the fight to defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq. But because we maintained relationships, we maintained personal contact with Iraqi SOF, even after we went to zero in 2011, when ISIS suddenly exploded on the world stage in 2014, we still had those relationships. And again, there are probably participants in this room. I certainly saw with my own eyes. Those pre-existing personal relationships were strategically indispensable in getting Iraqi SOF back into the fight and effectively leading the rest of the Iraqi military to recovering their will to fight and then going back into what ultimately was successful strategic combat against the Islamic State. Now, I'm not saying Iraqi SOF and U.S. Special Operations Forces were the only people doing anything here. There were plenty of conventional forces and allied forces that were contributing to what I just said. But the core imperative lesson for SOF is one of the benefits we derive from doing exquisite capacity building, advising and assisting of an international SOF element somewhere in the world, whether it's Ukraine, Iraq, or anywhere else, is we create a network of personal relationships, which if we are willing to invest in sustaining, can become an incredibly powerful and reliable contributor to solving a future problem that we do not yet have, but it is an important strategic hedge against the possibility that we will have a future problem where we need their help.
You talked about the transactional nature of some of these security cooperation or building partner capacity relationships. A conversation or a question in the chat, do we unfairly force our partners to try to make a decision between us and Russia or us and China when they're not really in a position to, I would say, make a choice? Can you talk a little bit about that, your experience as a TSOC commander?
Thank you. Again, because I've never been involved in the Ukraine context, I can't speak to what may or may not have happened around that particular problem. But if I somewhat alter your question into, have I seen us try to corner one of our allies or partners to get them to make a decision in ways that ultimately backfired on us? Absolutely. Absolutely. In too many occasions, I saw our emotional anger, frustration, or irritation with a partner because they were not immediately acquiescing to what we were asking of them, either as strongly or as rapidly as we wished they would, become self-defeating. I certainly understand that in some cases, these requests or these asks that we give these partner countries are very urgent, very strategically important, and the United States, in so many cases, has a lot riding on that international partner agreeing or acquiescing to what we are asking. But rather predictably, while that certainly happens sometimes, it just as often happens with that international actor looking at somebody like me and saying, you know, what you're asking me for is too difficult. I can't get there from here. I will be voted out of office, and then you'll have to deal with somebody more difficult. Answers along those lines. And the choice we have, because we are almost always the stronger actor in that transaction, we have an available choice that they do not. We have the available choice of being patient and forbearing. Very often our partner does not. But in too many cases, I've seen us refuse to be. And not only does that usually result in never getting what we want, but the word that we treated them that way gets around. That partner will talk to other partners around the world, and they'll tell them, I want you to know how the Americans treated me. And that can alter that other actor's calculation when we come to them and ask them for something difficult or complex. I get it that sometimes we have to do what we have to do, but our impatience and our lack of awareness of how we come across is, in some cases and in some places, debilitating to our own interests.
So we have a question from Jared Freberlino, Active Crisis Consulting. Following up on the question, the answer you just gave, we just had the first anniversary of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. How do you think that has affected the potential for future relationships? We've spent a lot of time and treasure and blood in Afghanistan, and our decision to stop that activity and remove ourselves from that. How do you think that has affected our potential for relationships in other parts of the world?
Thank you. This is a common topic of conversation in some of the circles I frequent in Washington, D.C. But I'll share with all of you the way I address it anytime I'm asked. It did us significant harm, and that harm will last for a long time. I don't think there's any scientific way of measuring it, but it's not minor harm. It's major harm. Maybe said another way, we put an enormous question mark on the reputation of the United States for countries everywhere, for actors everywhere. And that question mark is about whether or not I can rely on the United States. When the chips are down, can I rely on my partnership, on my alliance with the United States? Now, it is recoverable. It is recoverable. It doesn't have to be this way. But there's an old saying in common human discourse that I think is just as applicable to this question. You can lose your reputation in a single day. How long does it take you to recover it? It takes a long time. It takes disproportionate effort. It takes disproportionate investment. It takes disproportionate consistency. And eventually you can recover your reputation, but you can lose it in a day and it can take you years to recover it. That is true now for the United States.
Sir, with the changes to Joint Pub 1 that created information as a 7th Joint Function, thinking back on your time as a commander, we actually have a comment from Jack, who's a public affairs officer. Is there a need for operational public affairs? And thinking back on your staff, all of the information forces and information-related capabilities you had within your task force, within your command, what did you look for in an information professional to help you as a commander execute that information joint function?
That's a great question.
Softball.
Well, there's so many things come to mind, but because I don't want to blather on endlessly, I'll focus on the one that I wish I could tell you I thought this way for many years, but actually I didn't start thinking in the way I'm about to describe until I was confronted, as well as the rest of CENTCOM, with the sudden emergence of the Islamic State and the incredibly effective messaging capabilities and practices that they had. I mean, I'm sure everybody here remembers, in a very short period of time, through effective messaging, they persuaded tens of thousands of foreign fighters to flock to their black flag from all over the world. One of the single most impressive messaging activities I have ever seen, no matter how malign or evil I think it may have been. But getting back to your question, what I realized, probably too slowly, was that I actually had in my command people who were professionals at effective messaging activities, but they were not my Green Berets. They were not my Navy SEALs. They weren't my Marine Raiders. They weren't my Special Operations aviators. They were my civil affairs and PSYOPs professionals. So I told myself I needed to spend exponentially more time supporting and assisting the activities of my civil affairs and PSYOPs officers than I had ever done before. I will stipulate up front, it was totally inadequate because it was such a hard pivot for me. And there was, frankly, so much close combat I had to pay attention to in those early days of the emergency. But as I look back on it now, I'll say this, even though it's a little bit of a departure from the question, one of the great advantages that SOF has is because we do have professional career fields that are, I would argue, are trained, organized, and equipped to be at the forefront of effective information operations. They are our civil affairs and psychological operations elements. But do we treat them culturally? Do we treat them? Do we regard them as being just as important, and in some cases more important, than our door kickers, our little bird pilots, and the like? That's a cultural challenge for us, but it's one we need to rise to.
General Nagata, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and providing such clear-eyed and thought-provoking observations. You really set us up for success for day 2 of the forum. So thank you very much for spending time.
It's been my pleasure and my honor. Good luck to all of you.